So this was the fourth session of the course, we've been looking at globalization and to what extent globalization is reversible. We had some discussions last week about populism, and we tried to identify patterns, to what extent populism in different parts of the world seems to look similarly. And this week we've really honed in on the two big events of 2016 that have made these issues really front and center on the agenda of so many people, Brexit and then the election of Trump in the US. And just today had a guest, Mark Blythe from Brown University, always a thoughtful and creative and somewhat provocative thinker and presenter, who talked about what he dubs global Trumpism. And really what he did was to say, we shouldn't really be surprised that a lot of people feel the economy and globalization hasn't been working for them. And they're embracing a set of policies and a set of leaders who aren't holding back. And he traced some of the reasons for that all the way from the 1970s to today and how our economy has changed. So Eddie, what did you make of the session today? It was sort of an odd format with Mark sort of firing away with a lot of information for the first 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, look, I think, for a start, I think it's a fascinating topic that has huge relevance for, folks like me who are aspiring business leaders of the future. And, I think understanding some of these fundamental forces and, having a framework like Mark offered for us to kind of pick apart, what we hear as sensationalist kind of reporting and being able to piece together some of the economic storylines that sit underneath it. I found, very powerful. But, Mark's a colorful guy, and it's exciting to have folks like him be able to plug in from his holiday in Naples to offer his thoughts to a group of us from all over the world trying to wrestle with these big ideas.
And one of the things that I thought he did very effectively was to remind us that, just as a in terms of sort of social science and thinking through how we explain patterns, what we're seeing cannot be driven by racism or just xenophobia. It doesn't mean that some people might not be motivated by that anti-immigration sentiment doesn't play a role. In fact, we saw on Tuesday when we looked at Brexit that it played a really important role for a lot of people, migration from within the European Union and what it mattered. But he said, this is a much bigger story, a much more structural story about economic trends over the Western world, where a lot of people have benefited from globalization, primarily the very rich and sort of the emerging middle class in emerging countries, in particular for the middle class and lower middle class in wealthy countries. Globalization just hasn't been that great a deal, and policymakers have been ignoring the signals for a long time.
Yeah, and in fact, I think perhaps even to take it one step further, I found Mark's analysis to even be a story about power, in that it was a reflection on how, sure, we see these economic forces reflecting in a middle class and a lower middle class in the United States, certainly, that have essentially been stripped with economic power. And the political elite and economic elite have gone with their concentration of wealth, leading to an increased concentration of power. And therefore, we're seeing some of these economic repercussions kind of fall out of that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And he was talking about who this is good for, who this is bad for. And, he identified centrist parties as clearly losing out as a result of this misalignment that is happening. So, Sarah, what stood out for you today, or sort of as you're looking at where we are 2 weeks into the course?
I think one of the really interesting things that's come out in the last couple of weeks is intergenerational issues. So one of those is, who is voting for Brexit, who is voting for Trump, and kind of how that aligned with economic interests. So today, one of the things that I really took away was how kind of interest rates and inflation have built up a wealth in kind of the generation that is currently or was previously in control of the politics globally, and how millennials are impacted by that negatively, and what that means going forward. So does that mean positively that millennials become more of a force and are more active in politics, or is that creating the rise of populism that we're seeing today? So I thought that was a really fascinating aspect of our discussion.
And in fact, I mean, as you argued, right, it's the young people who shoulder the burden of debt for the most part, and they tend to not vote in nearly the same numbers as older voters. And then you end up with a set of policies that keep redistributing, that give benefits to the wealthy, to the older voters in particular, in terms of social security and welfare policies, but at the same time, protect their savings and their investments, when banks are bailed out. And a lot of that burden is already borne and will increasingly be borne by some of the younger people who ironically aren't the ones who haven't made their voices heard, right? I mean, one of the big factors in the Brexit vote that some young people stayed at home because they thought it was not going to lead to leave anyway. A lot of analyses have been done of the US presidential election where young people didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton quite the same way that they turned out for Barack Obama. And some people actually highlighting that as a causal factor. And you're right, one of the things that we're seeing in many countries is younger people now actually getting politically active. And political activity is great. You have to couple it with some interesting novel ideas. And if we do that, then perhaps we can roll back some of the challenges to the sort of global integrated order that at least I think the students in the course, MBAs from more than 20 countries, all around the world have sort of taken for granted and have sort of assumed is going to be the playing field in which they can develop their careers and their lives.
Definitely. And I think one of the students today coming from Turkey spoke about how they see kind of history repeating itself. And his big question was, how do we actually learn from the previous generation or kind of historical and political aspects that have come before us? And so I think that's a big question that we're also grappling with in this course, is not just what is globalization, what is populism, but kind of what does this mean for us as leaders going forward? How do we use this better understanding of the historical context to be leaders in this next generation?
Great.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that one of the questions I think for our generation is what is the threshold at which we would become engaged and active in a more profound way than kind of sitting on the sidelines. And I think the optimistic case for us from where we sit today is that some of these triggers become part of that trajectory for our generation, that it becomes a moment in time that kind of gets us from behind the screens of Twitter and Facebook and into the type of discourse or even voting that is truly kind of trying to influence the machinery of the world in which we live.
And I think, as Mark would say, it's great. A lot of young people are passionate about, the environment, sustainability, social issues, diversity, inclusion. All of that is important, but don't forget, economics. Don't forget interest rates and inflation and who pays for the banks and, what trade policies do we set up and what is the minimum wage? And, that kind of stuff really matters. It makes a big difference in people's lives. And if it goes uncontrolled, if we're not deliberate about it, people make decisions that favor themselves. And good reminder. I think, Sarah, you have a question right here. Somebody's worked in international development. How do you view what is going on in the United States? It's a broad question. Hold on. I think you were on mute. Go.
Sure. So something we've talked a lot about in this course is kind of how inequality forms. And I think we've discussed a bit about, particularly today, how the rise in inequality in the United States is an underlying trend of populism. And I think something that's interesting that we spoke about when we discussed what populism is and Mueller's book on the topic is that populism is fundamentally predicated on there being a multi-party or a democracy of some sort. And so something that is a really interesting difference between much of the developing world, where there might not be as many democracies, and the United States, is that the income inequality is a driver of political change
Yes.
through democratic processes. So populism comes to being, or Trump comes to be our president, because there is a response from the populace to inequality. And I think that's something that is lacking in much of the developing world. So I think that's one main difference I've seen.
Sure. Yeah. So, Eddie, one question for you, perhaps a little bit more on sort of the process of all of this. You're suddenly in twice a week in conversations with people you've never met before. We haven't met in person, and we're having this conversation here. What is that like to early in the morning, usually what is it, 7 o'clock in the morning, you get up in Berkeley and turn on your webcam and there you're connected with people all around the world. What is that like from a learning experience?
Look, I think that it's been striking. It's actually extraordinary to be, I've lived in New York and San Francisco now and a little bit in London. And whilst these are global cities, they actually narrow from a perspective in terms of what occupies their mind. And it's extraordinary to me to be having this discussion, not with a very Eurocentric or even very US-centric group of people, but in fact a truly global group of young aspiring leaders who care about these issues and challenges as we work out how we kind of chart a path for both understanding them and then influencing these over time. So, Sarah mentioned one of our classmates who was joining us from Istanbul. It's just wild to me that, we can wake up in the morning and gather around these topics and ideas, hear from kind of the leading global experts, no matter where they are in the world, and then, kind of break down the walls of, the existing kind of geographic centric conversations that we're all having and kind of gather a global audience around these topics. It certainly serves to remind me of just how much the reverberations of many of these topics are actually much more universal, and give me a much more insight into this is a global force, and get just much richer context from folks who are experiencing firsthand what I seem to have experienced, Brexit and Trump firsthand. For them, it's, a similar pattern and story with different cultural and contextual unique elements, but it's fascinating to kind of gather that much more global perspective.
That's great. And you're right. I mean, it's global issues and global challenges, and to get global perspectives on that doesn't just mean, a global newspaper or a global news outlet. It's actually, connecting with people who are right there, on the ground, in the Philippines or in Turkey or in China and in Indonesia and Japan and so on, getting their perspective, and collaborating with them. So, we're grateful that you signed up for this. I mean, you're a pioneer here, doing this, and I hope you'll continue to enjoy it, and thanks for all the contributions to what we're doing.
Yeah, no worries. Look, I see it as a great privilege. I mean, it's a big question on whether these kind of global and virtual classrooms really work. And so it's been the first time that I've been part of something like this for sure. But I've been surprised at just how effective it really is. Win for technology, Silicon Valley, all of that.
There you go. But to connect people, which is what we're all about here in the Global Network. So thank you so much to you, Eddie, for sticking around a little bit longer. Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to head to the airport and fly to Ireland, where I'm meeting students from the Smurfit School tomorrow, another Global Network school, and then I'll be back at Yale over the weekend. And Sarah, we'll connect then back in New Haven.
Safe travels.
All right. Cheers. Thank you all.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.